preaching, speaking at protests and rallies, telling, was it Squirrels, Timmy and Jimmy? Telling Timmy and Jimmy stories during children's time, reading poetry at the Christmas coffee house, writing beautiful litanies and letters to the editor, giving hugs, leading us on wildflower walks on Easter Day, holding forth in a conversation about something he deemed important, and just as easily laughing at himself in his own self-deprecating way. We have so many good memories of him, such a good man, very stubborn at times, and goofy at others, but such a good man, pastor, social justice advocate, poet and writer, friend, wildflower guide, and of course, committed clown of God. The other night I got to hear lots of wonderful family stories with the Lackeys all about John. Stories of family vacations every summer, camping at the beach and in the mountains, chasing a bear off with a broomstick, and running from a dozen or so bears at a garbage dump, getting lost in the woods so often that the kids hesitated to go with them on hikes sometimes. And I heard about what it's like to be a preacher's kid, hearing that typewriter at night, working on a sermon, cranking the mimeograph machine and folding bulletins with John and Glendon, getting to pick him sometimes, getting help and sometimes too much help on school papers, waiting for him to check his calendar before he could say yes to something, standing and walking with him at rallies and protests for important issues, learning that nobody's perfect, not even a great man like your dad. But most of all in those stories, I heard love and admiration and the joy that comes from the shared adventure of family life, and I just really appreciate hearing them and experiencing that with you the other night. But now I'd like to just try to tell you a remarkable, joyful story about a man raised to be racist and narrow-minded, who encountered the love of Jesus along the way and was transformed by it. John was born in High Point, North Carolina, the son of Fred and Morbelle Lackey. He grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, with his brother Fred Jr. and his sis, Catherine. His grandfather had owned a very successful grocery store that failed during the Depression, so his father drove a truck delivering grain and feed for a milling company. So grew up with not in total poverty or anything, but not having a whole lot too. John grew up in a racist and divided society, not to mention sexist and homophobic. Like many people at that time, his father and mother were racist. Just about everyone around John was racist, and by default, so was John. He also grew up in a church that was essentially fundamentalist. He got saved in that tradition at age 12 when he heard about God's love. But John always said he soon found that the love which they proclaimed was very conditional, depending entirely on whether you lived up to the church's expectations, which they also viewed as God's expectations. John joined the Navy at the age of 17 and volunteered for submarine duty during World War II, mostly in the Pacific. The final test in boot camp was swimming around a huge pool surrounded by 1,200 recruits. Well, John was from upstate North Carolina and he couldn't swim a lick. So he stood there terrified until he was the last one to go. And pretty soon, the sailors, his fellow recruits, were chanting and cheering and cheering him on, so he finally jumped in and somehow made it all the way around the pool to a rousing ovation. And some people say he swam. I've also heard family members say they think he doggy paddled, but he got around. And that's how a 17-year-old kid from North Carolina who couldn't swim ended up bunking on a submarine 18 inches directly below a torpedo for the duration of the war. During one stretch in the North Atlantic, his sub docked in New London, Connecticut on weekends. And while all of his buddies would head for the closest bar every weekend, John took the train into New York City, where he was transported and transformed by museum visits, Broadway plays, a performance of Madame Butterfly, and the music of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. Now, where did that impulse come from with this kid from North Carolina? Who knows? But it changed him into a lover of the arts and music. After the war, John went to Wake Forest University to study journalism. He wanted to write and to travel. By the way, he was also on the track team at Wake Forest and could apparently run like the wind, even into his 30s. So the neighborhood kids would goad him into chasing them just so they could see how fast he could run.